I've listed some people there whose ideas and work I'm drawing on. Some of them are here. They're present and past members of my research group. So a couple of contextual slides. One is that if we're interested in managing, a fairly obvious one, but worth thinking about spatially, if we're interested in managing the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, then we need to be managing some of the areas outside as well. John made the point earlier that a big chunk of Queensland drains into the Great Barrier Reef Lagoon and taking with it some things that we don't necessarily want there. Then we have Torres Strait to the north, which the management of which influences some aspects of the Great Barrier Reef. We have the Coral Sea just to the east. What you can see there is the Federal Labor's zoning plan for the Coral Sea. It wasn't a very good zoning plan in terms of biodiversity outcomes. Management zones are now on hold under the coalition, and we'll wait and see what comes out of that. The point is, of course, that whatever you do in the Great Barrier Reef influences areas outside and vice versa. Here's an overview of some of the points that I want to cover. The main one is that the 2004 rezoning process was very rightly lauded internationally. It was a fabulous exercise, a lot of blood, sweat and tears, and really set the scene internationally. But that was 10 years ago, and we've learnt a lot since then, and thinking about spatial planning and what the Great Barrier Reef needs have come a long way, not just with work locally in the GBR, but other places in Australia and internationally. At some stage, there'll be another rezoning. We don't know when. A lot of people would prefer not to talk about it because they're still recovering from the last one in lots of ways. But sooner or later there will be, and the sooner we start preparing for that, the better prepared we will be. And I'm going to talk about, just beyond zoning, of course, the marine park, a whole package of approaches, some of which have been mentioned and alluded to in previous talks. And that package includes, but is larger than a rezoning exercise. And I'm going to talk about 6 key elements. And in the following slides, I'll unpack each of those slightly. But this is a talk that is going for breadth rather than depth. So I want to give you an idea of the things that are being done already and the things that could be done to better manage the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. So here are the 6 things that I want to expand on. Better methods for using biodiversity pattern in planning, better methods for using threats and actions in planning, better methods for dealing with dynamic disturbances in spatial planning, managing catchments for multiple objectives, managing cumulative impacts and offsets, and John's pointed out already that we need to lift our game considerably there, and then finally measuring the right things. So here's then a bit of information on each of those, and this is not comprehensive. You could add plenty of dot points. Better methods for using biodiversity pattern in planning. We had a set of bioregions for the Great Barrier Reef in 2004, each of which had a 20% representation target in no-take zones and a bunch of other rules. We could do better than that now. Here's some preliminary work based on the seabed biodiversity dataset, AIMS, CSR and others, and we've started to explore what else we could do. What you see in that top left map is a classification of the sites into several groups or assemblages. Once we've got those, and they're based on species composition or taxonomic composition, Once we've got those, there's no reason why each one has to have the same objective, 20% of each thing or any other percentage. And we could use species area curves, which we've done again in a preliminary way, to indicate that if you wanted to represent the same proportion of species in each of those assemblages, those species area curves would be a guide for what your relative objective should be. Some would be larger, some would be smaller. And we've, as you can see, we've done some initial analyses of that. We can refine those to deal with things like compositional overlap, which varies between pairs of assemblages and really needs to be taken into account. Spatial autocorrelation, meaning that close sites are more similar than distant sites. And understanding the actual patterns of compositional change, which are not unpacked in those species area curves. There are certain patterns, spatial patterns, that we can't see from those curves. Ideally, we need to know all of that. And for that matter, we could, in fact, plan with those continuous curves rather than threshold objectives. And there are pros and cons of doing planning in those two ways, and we need a discussion on that as we go forward. Threats and actions. We've got a project underway on islands in the southern Great Barrier Reef, and a very similar one underway on islands off the Pilbara coast in Western Australia. In both places, we're working with island managers, in the case of the GBR, the Queensland Parks and Wildlife. And the problem statement really is lots of islands, lots of management issues, not enough people, not enough money. How do you set priorities in space and time? We're developing some new software to do that, and using extensive elicitation mainly from managers to get information that's not available in data sets. We're interested in the dynamics of threats and actions and costs. So a quick example there is how much it costs to do anything on an island depends on how many other islands you're going to in that trip, and for that matter, how many things you're doing on each island. Trying to take that into account. We're trying to estimate the temporal aspects of threats and actions and responses of native species. We've done a lot of literature work. We've done a lot of elicitation with managers. That's still underway. We don't have the data sorted yet, which is why I'm giving you some data-free graphs. But what this is meant to indicate is that after arrival, the population of rats on an island might do something like this. The response through time of native species could be any one of these functions or something intermediate. We're trying to estimate sets or families of functions of responses and increase in pests. And this is assuming they're not there already. That's another consideration. The important thing about this is if we are prioritising through time, we need to try and estimate time with threats and responses and our actions, because that will tell us the consequences of not acting on a particular island this year and leaving our actions for 2 years or 3, versus somewhere where actions might be much more critical for intervention. And I'll also mention that this work builds on some really nice research by Mariana Fuentes, who's, as Helene mentioned, one of the speakers tonight. We've just had this paper accepted in ecological applications, so we can send it around now. This was a lot of work by Mariana on flatback turtles in Western Cape York, where she spent a long time talking to local communities about what sort of management actions were possible and feasible and acceptable, and then set up a system for prioritising within a fixed budget. And that work is very applicable to the Great Barrier Reef coast and also to the work we're doing on islands. Okay, dynamic disturbances. There are lots of them out there, and dynamics weren't really considered explicitly in the last rezoning. So there's nothing to say that a zoning scheme based largely on pattern will do the job for dynamics. We need to find out whether that's the case. Planning for dynamics, like any sort of planning, involves three key things: data, let's say data and models together, objectives, and then spatial interventions. We need all three to be done really well, or we don't do the job right. And often it's the objectives that are overlooked. If we don't get the objectives right, we can have really good models and end up with not very good spatial recommendations. In terms of models, there's been some work by us and other groups on time series analysis, satellite imagery. What you can see on the right-hand side are satellite-derived temperature anomalies for a couple of months in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. You can see that's just representative of how things change from month to month. We've done some indicative proof of concept planning based on historical data, time series data for the last 25 years or so, but we're not planning, in fact, for the last 25 years, we're planning for the next 50 to 100. And so we need to be able to look forward, and that means running these models forward with the uncertainty that involves for not just temperature anomalies, of course, but river plumes and cyclones, the other big disturbances. Understanding how species and ecosystems of interest respond to those things, and ideally doing that not just in a spatially explicit way, but in a temporally explicit way, so that we understand the erratic nature of events and the different times that reefs have to recover between those events. And then for objectives, there are some good precedents out there. We can in fact set objectives, even though it might seem counterintuitive, for spatial management in response to dynamic disturbances. Some of the lessons come from the marine environment, some of the lessons come from the terrestrial environment, and there are values in looking across the shoreline to map out a way forward. There are quite a few studies now on the table, and it's time for us to sit down and discuss ways forward, especially in relation to objectives. Managing catchments is something that John's talked about a fair bit already. We know that we need to prioritise for water quality abatement at the resolution of subcatchments. And John and others are getting close to doing that. I'd argue that while we're doing that, it would be irresponsible not to try to achieve other objectives at the same time, to do with biodiversity and carbon, partly because it would be a bad way to spend a limited amount of money unless we were getting maximum benefit, and partly because it would ignore some important natural resources. These kinds of actions we would take in any one area to achieve objectives for water quality, biodiversity and carbon will vary on the landscape type. And this is something that John's been trying to impress on me while we have coffee and talk about this, and I'm starting to understand it. That we could, for example, think about 4 types of country in the catchments: grazing country and native rangelands, riparian zones, agriculture in general, and then cane. And there'd be, for each of those broad sets of objectives, there would be different actions for protection and restoration in each of those cells. And the trick then would be for any kind of country to align those actions and benefits as much as possible. And that thinking is now underway. And the final point, which John understands, and other people here too better than I do, which is that we need to move beyond targets for water quality at river mouths and start thinking about what our objectives would be further offshore for different kinds of reefs, and how we would use biological information to inform those objectives ecologically. All right, now managing cumulative impacts and offsets. John has referred to this whole packet as a failure, and that's a good way of summing it up. Basically, 3 points. Attempts to assess cumulative impacts are really well short of where we need to be and where we can be. Here's a diagram from a paper by Alana Gretsch and others. And what this really tries to do is say, spatially, we need to be moving beyond the site to the scale of the whole barrier reef on the vertical. Horizontally, we need to be moving in terms of understanding pressures from individual pressures to combinations of them. And then this third dimension is really moving from impacts on individual species to understanding the interactions and flow and effects of those. This is really, this red area is where we do our business at the moment. So we're poodling around in the worst corner of this space. And it's illegal, unfortunately, to assess things in a very narrow context without looking at their accumulation in time and space, and across pressures and across elements of biodiversity. There was an exercise, a voluntary exercise, to do a cumulative assessment for Abbott Point. We've been fairly generous in allocating it to these 4 cells because there was a lot of vagueness and qualitative assessments involved. But even if you stretched what's been done so far, we move into those yellow cells. Where we need to be is there, up in the top right. And it will be some time before we can do that, of course, but we can approach that much more closely than we're doing at the moment with the information and the models that we have available to us. Managing the future, we obviously want to know what's coming at us in terms of developments and pressures. We've got a project underway doing spatially explicit scenarios for the Great Barrier Reef Coastal Zone, interpreting those for the marine environment as well. So these are land uses here in a couple of areas. These are shipping movements under different scenarios. We've got 8 scenarios that combine a variety of external pressures and internal policy responses. In relation to each of those scenarios, Amelie and others are developing Bayesian models of, in this case, responses of seagrasses. So this is a way of getting at cumulative impacts much more comprehensively than that has been done in EIS processes in that, going back to that diagram I just showed you. And the final point is to do with offsets. If you have to have offsets, there are ways of doing it well. And this is a diagram. It's not for unpacking the detail. There's a paper. I can give you the reference by Melissa Bose and others, laying out best practice guidelines for dealing with offsets in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park or World Heritage Area. The key elements are avoid and mitigate before you even think about offsetting. Put a whole lot of decisions in place in the right sequence, and make sure you've got all of that in place and you know exactly what you're supposed to be offsetting before the development is approved. That's not what we do now. What we have now is approvals and then bringing in offsets as some sort of half-baked mopping up exercise later. But it's not what we have to do. We know there are better methods out there. Final slide, measuring and targeting the right things. We want to make a difference, basically, with zones in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, but in environmental management in the catchments and outside the marine park in the marine environment. We all want to make a difference. Saving the environment, saving species is what we want to do. We very rarely measure that, and there are some rare exceptions that apply to the zoning plan for the marine park. But for environmental management more generally, as it needs to apply to the Great Barrier Reef and its catchments, we're pretty poor at measuring the right things. The key things to look at in this diagram are the blue boxes. Inputs, dollars, staff, outputs, in the case of, say, protected areas, how many hectares, in the case of land management, how many kilometres of fence, outcomes in terms of sampling, how many vegetation types do we have at some time in the protected area system, outcomes, to what extent have we mitigated threats through our protected areas. But what we're really talking about is impact evaluation. Impact evaluation is really well established in medicine, education, lots of other fields where people not only want to make a difference, but they want to measure how well they're doing. We tend not to measure impacts. A lot of the political discourse is right down this end to do with dollars invested. A lot of the political announcements to do with outputs. These have very tenuous links to how much difference we actually make. And there are techniques for getting an impact evaluation for environmental management if we choose to use them. These points, just to finish, the strategy for doing all this is bigger. Of course, I've given you a sketch of some of the things that need to be done. There are others. This will require a lot of people, a lot of skills, a lot of institutions, and working together, hopefully, in a coordinated way. You might be asking whether this has all been done in the strategic environment assessment. I'd say no. And we could line up the strategic environmental assessments against those requirements and others and look for specific, explicit and reliable statements with commitments of funding to see how the political process measures up. Clearly there are large benefits of doing this, regardless of anything to do with political timetables for rezoning. Thanks.